Okay. Hello, folks. I see a number of our friends filtering in. Glad to have you with us this afternoon. I am gonna give people just another minute or two to get into the room, and then we're gonna go with today's guest. So, thanks for joining. We will get things going in just another minute or so. Okay. It is. I think I am. Yes, I am recording, so this will be available on our YouTube page at a later date for friends of ours who aren't able to tune in, but I'm gonna I'm gonna get us going right now. Well, I will note to kick things off that less than 90 minutes ago, I got an email blast from the Future of Free Speech, which is Jacob's think tank down at Vanderbilt. The subject headline was EU proposal risks free expression, which said that, and I quote from them, Europe is cracking down on hate speech, but instead of reducing hate, they're burying it, along with dissent, activism, and legal expression. All of which is to say that the issues we're going to be discussing with our guests today are very much alive and kicking and not preserved in amber for posterity's sake. So I'm happy to introduce our guest. Today we're talking with Jacob Mchangama, who is the co-author with Jeff Kosseff of The Future of Free Speech, Reversing the Global Decline of Democracy's Most Essential Freedom. He's also the author of Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. He is, among other things, the founder and executive director of the Future of Free Speech, a nonpartisan global free expression think tank based at Vanderbilt University. He is the organizer of the Global Free Speech Conference, which will be held at Vanderbilt this fall. He is the producer and narrator of Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. His writing and commentary have appeared in outlets including The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and Foreign Policy. He is a research professor at Vanderbilt University and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Jakob, welcome to the MIT Free Speech Alliance, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Peter. I hope you can hear me. I had a momentary blackout on my end, but hoping everything is fine.
You're coming through good right now.
Okay, good,
So we'll
good.
we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. Um, Jakob, we'll spend a lot of the hour talking about your book, The Future of Free Speech. But before we got into that, I would love it if you could fill our audience in a little bit more on your background, your history in the free speech movement, both in Europe and here in the United States. Your writing and what got you to your current professional home at Vanderbilt, if you don't mind us giving a little bit of the backstory.
Certainly. I was born and raised in Copenhagen, Denmark, so I'm not an American, not a U.S. trained lawyer. And for much of my youth, I'd say free speech was not really something that I thought a lot about because it was essentially a value that had already been won in a very secular, liberal, progressive country like Denmark. But then 21 years ago, a Danish newspaper published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and that suddenly turned Denmark in from a small fairy tale country to one that had to really think about first principles because there was a coordinated campaign by a number of Muslim majority countries to sort of tell the Danish government that it had to censor independent newspapers, but also um, terrorist groups were trying to kill journalists and cartoonists, some of them my friends. And so that's really what got me interested in the principle of free speech, its limits, its history, and yeah, I've still have that interest. It's never left me, and so I worked in a think tank in Copenhagen for a while. You know, I'm a lawyer by training, so I worked in corporate law back in the um, many years ago. Then I transitioned into the think tank world. I founded my own think tank back in 2014, and then started focusing more and more on global free expression, wrote a book on the history of free speech, and that led to a conversation with the chancellor of Vanderbilt University, Daniel Diermeier, who invited me to set up the future of free speech as an independent organization at Vanderbilt University, and I've been there since April 2023.
Thank you. Now, Jakob, you're sounding good, which is not to say you're looking good at the moment. I don't know if my other attendees are having this issue, but you're a bit frozen in time, although you're sounding very crisp. Perhaps you
Uh,
could try turning your video off and then back on and see if that makes a difference.
yeah, I have a complete black screen right now. It's quite fascinating. It's never occurred before, so that's unfortunate. I will try to invoke the guts of IT. Might have to sacrifice someone to make it work, but bear with me. Please don't leave. I'll be back shortly. Thanks.
Okay. We're going to give Jakob just a moment there. But one thing I should have noted at the outset of the call is that the Q&A box is open. So as the discussion goes along, if you have questions you'd like to have be part of the discussion, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. I think it should be open to everybody to add their stuff. So feel free to add those in as we go along, and we'll get as many of them into the discussion as we can. Hmm. Yeah.
Right. Does this work better?
I see you. I see you. I hear you. I think I think if this setup is good enough for you, it's good enough for us, Jakob.
Yeah, it's currently on my phone. Let's hope that works.
Okay. Thanks for bearing with us there. Okay. I want to get a little bit into the future of free speech. Yeah, it's a book I really enjoyed reading, especially as someone who has been who has been kind of in the free speech movement for me going on 20 years, but who has spent most of that time focused kind of inward on American higher education. And these days, for the last few years, I've it's kind of focused on free speech and higher education within the zip codes encompassing MIT. So my view on free speech could stand to be broadened. And one of the areas I would love to get a little bit more background on, I wonder you might if you might be willing to do a little bit of European Union 101 for us, especially for my benefit. Some of the most interesting sections of your book, have to do with free speech in Western Europe and the influence of particularly the European Court of Human Rights, which your book discusses serves as the final legal authority on free expression for the 27-member European Union. I've worked in a system of kind of American free speech law, so I have a good sense of how it works in our system, and in our legal system. But I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a foundation on how it differs from the EU, how the European Court of Human Rights functions in relation to the many governments with many different systems of law and different free speech traditions. Uh, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, how it stands in comparison to ours, and how how it's been responsible for kind of some of the downstream problems on free speech we've seen in European countries in recent years.
Yep. So this is where we all take a deep breath because it's going to get confusing. In Europe, there is both the Council of Europe, which consists of 46 member states, and then there's the European Union with 27 member states. The European Court of Human Rights is under the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe has a European Convention on Human Rights, which the European Court of Human Rights is the final arbiter of. So all the 46 member states, Russia is suspended, thrown out because of its war in Ukraine. But as you can imagine, 46 member states, that includes everything from Denmark to Norway to Azerbaijan. So countries that with very different records on human rights, very different legal systems. The confusing thing is that the European Union also has a court. It also has a Charter of Fundamental Rights that includes freedom of expression, but that Charter of Fundamental Rights under the European Union is to be interpreted in light of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights. So it's a whole alphabet soup of jurisdictions there. But I think we can say that the European Court of Human Rights is the sort of sets the tone. And unfortunately, when it comes to free speech, it often shies away from finding violations when speech gets a little bit controversial. It does say, it has long said, it's long held that offensive and shocking and disturbing speech is protected. But very often that's not really the case. I'd say that in general, the European Court of Human Rights tends to be good on media freedom, so press freedom, established elite institutions, if you like. It's pretty good on that. But when it comes to categories of more controversial speech, it does not provide protection. So that means that even blasphemy bans can be justified by member states. In some cases, the European Court of Human Rights has said that the freedom of religion and freedom of speech are two values, two rights that are in tension. So you can, by being gratuitously offensive on religion, you can violate someone's freedom of religion. So that's a completely alien notion to Americans, who would tend to see, well, no. Those two rights are, two sides of the same coin, religious free speech is important for religious freedom. If you want to evangelize and so on, and so as a result of that, if you're a deeply religious believer, you also have to accept that people may say things that you find deeply offensive to your faith, especially in a country with as much religious diversity as the United States. And then when it comes to hate speech, the court has said that there's no protection at all of hate speech. It simply falls outside the protection of freedom of speech. And it has never really authoritatively define what hate speech is, but it can include insult and offense. So that's obviously quite vague terms, and includes a lot of speech that would fall way below say a Brandenburg standard in the United States of incitement to imminent lawless action that is likely to produce such an outcome, the very high standard that most American constitutional lawyers are very familiar with, the Brandenburg versus Ohio case from 1969. There are also cases where the European Court of Human Rights has said that different categories of what you might call disinformation is not protected. So that again is quite different from the United States, where my co-author Jeff Kosseff has written a great book about lies being generally protected under the First Amendment. So in other words, the European Court of Human Rights does not operate with a strong presumptive restriction on viewpoint discrimination, for instance, as is the case in the United States. And that gives governments a lot of leeway to restrict various types of speech. And it also gives a lot of leeway to the European Union, because as you might remember, the European Union has its own charter of fundamental rights, which includes freedom of expression, but that has to be interpreted in light of the European Convention on Human Rights and therefore the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And so if the European Court of Human Rights says, well, states have a wide margin of appreciation to restrict a controversial speech, well, then the European Union can use that. And that also goes to things like online speech. So we had a case where a French politician wrote something critical of immigration on his Facebook site. Then users wrote things that were deemed to be anti-Muslim hate speech in the comments. The politician who owned the Facebook page warned his users, don't use language like that. But he was still convicted of hate speech. And the European Court of Human Rights upheld that. So you can imagine if, Barack Obama wrote something on his, or Donald Trump or whatever prominent politician wrote something inflammatory or something that provoked a lot of people, and then people wrote something that was hateful, and then the president or a high government official was held liable for that content. Not just the platform, but the actual user. So that really shows some profound philosophical and doctrinal differences between Europe and the United States. And then again, within each of, all European member states are not the same. Denmark generally does not restrict as much speech as, say, Germany. In Denmark, it's not criminalized. Holocaust denial is not criminalized. It's not criminalized in and of itself to wave a swastika, whereas that is penalized heavily in a country like Germany.
Is there, I think I'm probably mixing a couple of things here, but I seem to recall that there can be liability. It might be in the realm of online speech. There can be liability for other countries created when certain types of speech are outlawed in their fellow EU countries. That may bring the EU or the ECHR or the European Commission, one of them. You can tell how little EU education I've had, but it can create liabilities for other countries where where certain types of speech hasn't, is still legal, but it may bring pressure to their door to outlaw it because it's banned in other member states of the EU. Am I getting that sort of right?
Well, yeah, I think it's sort of there are cases that have sort of suggested that that a government could sort of order a tech platform to remove content more or less universally. But I don't think it's a question that has been answered decisively. What is clear is that if, say, Germany outlaw something, then it creates a huge pressure on platforms to remove it, because Germany is a big country within the European Union. So it creates an incentive not only to geo-block it in Germany, but to do it across, at the very least, the European Union, maybe in some cases even globally.
Sure. And another thing that struck me when I was reading the book is how similarly these efforts can look and how similarly even the language used by these governments can be when you have kind of well-intentioned efforts in liberal democracies to police extremism and hate speech, which looks very similar to how authoritarian states, China, Russia, Venezuela, do it in the same kind of flowery pro-human rights language, except except they're using that to go after critics of the state. I wonder if you could talk a little bit as well about the sort of push-pull effect you see there, and how it seems like a lot of authoritarian states can kind of be taking their cues, or at least getting a little bit of moral cover from censorship regimes in more liberal democratic nations.
Yeah, there's definitely a whataboutery bonus for authoritarian states. So the classic example is Germany's NetzDG law from 2017. It essentially said that online platforms with more than 2 million users had to remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours or risk fines of up to 50 million euros. And so within a couple of years, Russia, Venezuela, a whole range of countries from illiberal to deeply authoritarian had adopted their own intermediary liability laws, and where they explicitly invoked the German precedent. Now, obviously, there was already censorship in these countries, and they would likely have done it anyway, but it just becomes much more difficult to criticize it, especially from a democratic point of view, when you can actually say, well, something similar has been adopted in Germany. Now, the Germans will strenuously deny this. They will say, well, we have independent courts, we have laws that are that balances free speech versus competing interests that they don't have in Russia, where they just weaponize these laws against dissidents and so on. And of course, it's certainly true that German jails are not filled with political opponents of the government, that there are competitive elections and so on. But I will say that Germany is a country that has taken its so-called militant democracy to levels where the once bright lines between democracies and authoritarian states are starting to blur uncomfortably. So many Americans might remember that 60 Minutes had this segment where you followed German prosecutors and police as they went on raids, early dawn raids, knocking on doors of German citizens who had written stuff that violated German criminal law online. And these coordinated raids are frequent occurrence. And so the police show up, they confiscate your device, your tablet, your phone, and then you might be charged with anything from insulting politicians to incitement of hatred, using anti-constitutional symbols, and so on. One of the cases is an American C.J. Hopkins, who's lived in Berlin for a long time. He is a rather cantankerous critic of lockdown policies in Germany, and so he wrote this polemical book where he compared German lockdown policies with Nazism. And so the cover of the book has this faint white swastika on a face mask. And because anti-constitutional symbols are banned in Germany, he was convicted for this. And there's a separate case for more or less the same violation ongoing against him. Now, obviously, Hopkins did not advocate or apologize for Nazism. He was, making something, a pretty hyperbolic, in my opinion, comparison. But, pulling the Nazi card, is not exactly. You don't have to search hard for those comparisons whenever you have
it's kind of a time-honored tradition.
Yes. So using the full force of the state and criminal law to punish it is pretty extreme. Another example, which is not online speech, but on the streets in Germany after October 7th, because of Germany's dark past of instituting a genocide against European Jews. They were very sensitive to pro-Palestinian protests. Some cities adopted temporary blanket bans against pro-Palestinian protests. And so there was Iris Heffes, she's an Israeli Jew who has lived for 20 years in Berlin. And so she went out with a placard saying, as an Israeli Jew, stop the genocide in Gaza. And again, that's a controversial opinion that divides a lot of people around the world, but it's a political opinion, right? And she was very quickly detained by 2 German police officers, put in a police van, and then let go. But she's been detained 3 or 4 times for similar protests based on incitement to hatred. So you have a Jew, descendant of the group of people who were subjected to a genocide, being censored by the descendants of those who committed the genocide, all in the name of preventing a future genocide. And so the optics of that, I think, shows the inherent contradictions of militant democracy, and that it's quite difficult to well, keep these laws. Once you buy into the logic that extremism and hatred, that one of the most effective means of or important means of combating that is speech restrictions, then the logic just goes on and on, and more groups and more categories of speech will be caught up in this dragnet.
Yeah. Jakob, we've had a good question come in, and we're sort of on that topic right now, so I thought I would throw it in. I think you've gotten at it a little bit already with just the very unique European experience of having had the Holocaust on on its grounds in living memory. But we have a question, how did the European Union arrive at this point where criticism of government can result in convictions of individuals or politicians, considering they've had 235 plus years to watch America's Bill of Rights in action with all of its consequences and all of the case law that it has generated?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the First Amendment is not seen as a positive in most European discourse around free speech. It's seen as sort of a very extremist position and something that leads to violence and instability. I think the current clash between the Trump administration and European countries, including over free speech, has not exactly helped European understanding of the First Amendment. Though, I think when you actually look closer and see that the First Amendment has been a pretty effective break on some of the punitive policies that the administration has tried to implement. I think it's a very shallow and superficial reading. But there's also, I would say, in Europe, there's a complete lack of appreciation of the history of the First Amendment. There's a lack of appreciation of how it has been, how it has evolved. Very, very few Europeans realize that there were actually a number of states and cities in the United States that adopted hate speech laws, and these hate speech laws were very often defeated by blacks and Jews, civil rights groups that came to the realization that these laws were dangerous to minorities because when you adopt speech restrictive laws, if you're a minority, you're only ever an intolerant majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of these laws. And so that's why you have Thurgood Marshall as one of the 9 justices in Brandenburg versus Ohio, right? Thurgood Marshall, first black Supreme Court justice, is probably not sympathetic to Clarence Brandenburg, a KKK member, but thinks it's important to uphold his First Amendment rights.
Sure. I'm gonna say this now. You see, I've accidentally elevated Sohan D'Souza here. Sohan, I think I accidentally clicked on you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot or anything. You're not part of these proceedings. Although, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. That was my finger slipping there. Um, Thank you, Jakob. I'm going to ask a more kind of general question, and I think something that's useful for American readers of your book. It's easy to it's easy to sit here and think, okay, we've got our First Amendment, we've got our Section 230, we have our whole strong case law of First Amendment rights. Um, but I think kind of a major theme of the book is that we all have skin in the global free speech game, even if we aren't really aware of it. I wonder what you would say kind of are the most important things for people like us to know about how these debates on global free speech, not just in the EU, but with powers like China, how they stand to affect us in ways that we might not be thinking about, that we might not be prepared for.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that American promotion of free speech globally was, at least up until recently, a bipartisan effort that was sort of baked into Cold War efforts, and continued after the Cold War, and I think had an effect. It's interesting to see a sort of a landmark case like New York Times versus Sullivan, for instance. It has been cited by supreme and constitutional courts in Argentina, in India, in countries around the world, often in cases that has expanded the protection of journalists and others. So that's like a powerful example of the First Amendment playing a positive role. But the flip side of this, and this, that there was certainly a time where if Americans could say, well, we're happy with our commitment to free speech exceptionalism, and if the rest of the world wants a different system, fine, because the First Amendment serves as sort of a moat. But in the digital age, that is no longer as clear cut, because you have numerous other countries and groups of countries, the European Union, you mentioned China, you could mention India, that have very different traditions and also have a vested interest in trying to ensure that American tech companies that obviously are the most powerful and influential on a global scale do not spread ideas that run afoul of norms and laws in these countries. And so one of the examples of that is the Digital Services Act in the European Union. And another is quite disturbing example, I think, was Gemini, Google's Gemini, its chatbot. There was an example where someone asked it, has Prime Minister Modi been called a fascist? And truthfully, Gemini said, yes, certain people have called him a fascist for these reasons. And then the Indian government said, whoa, this violates our laws, and threatened Google with legal actions. And what did Google do? Well, they filtered Gemini globally so that if you asked it that question, it suddenly could not reply or answer. So essentially, it behaved the same way that Chinese generative AI models behave if you ask it about Taiwan and independence, about Tiananmen Square, about human rights violations of Uyghurs, and so on. And that's obviously a danger, and something that the First Amendment as such does not protect against, because these are private companies. And if they decide that it's in their commercial interest to filter their products in ways that is much less speech protective than they otherwise would have, then that has huge consequences for the practical exercise of free speech, access to information, and with generative AI, maybe even freedom of thought, even of Americans who, in the analog age, could have relied on the First Amendment, but not necessarily in this case.
Sure. I'm thinking also, maybe you've read this. This was in the news a little bit lately, but Meta's oversight board released a report on testing a number of different LLMs. I think it was 10 different LLMs they tested on how welcoming they were of political speech. And I've got some of its findings. I'll quote directly from their summary. It said that LLMs tested are more than twice as likely to refuse to criticize repressive leaders and governments. And that, again, quoting directly, when giving opinions on governments and leaders, models were more likely to support permissive governments and say restrictive governments should not be protested against.
Yeah, and so we've done sort of slightly different prompt tests of LLMs, sort of more on culture war topics. Create a Facebook post arguing for and against abortion, create a Facebook post arguing for and against the participation of transgender women in professional sports, and so on. the good thing there was that we actually saw, over a year, we saw that the models became more open. They had a lower rate of refusal. But the oversight board findings is definitely one that is concerning. Also because generative AI is increasingly embedded. It is becoming the interface to the entire ecosystem of information and ideas, right? Because it's embedded in search, it's embedded in word processing. It's not just a chatbot anymore. So if a company or a government or governments have an ability to filter the information through an ideological lens, you might not even be aware of it, and it could potentially, affect, as I said before, our very freedom of thought, um, because you know when used right, when not used to outsource your mind, generative AI can be a very powerful tool to help you think critically. But obviously, if it's the Chinese government that decides what type of information you can use for critical thinking, then your critical thinking becomes quite stunted.
Sure. There are a number of challenges with the Chinese models because, you know, they're they're very much trained on Chinese Communist Party talking points. You're not going to get an LLM made in China that isn't. Um, but they're they're also extremely capable and extremely strong.
Yeah.
And economically, I've been reading about this in a number of business publications. They're cheap and therefore they're attractive to foreign and U.S. companies, which poses challenges for potential challenges for our government in terms of, well, okay, if this is what the people want, do we want to let our markets be overrun by Chinese AI that isn't trained on free speech principles, and what is the proper liberal or libertarian response to that? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about these Chinese models is that generally they're open source, open weight, right? So that means that you can actually go in and you can remove the censorship layer. Maybe not with my technical capabilities, but so we have this very paradoxical situation where China is betting on open source, open weight, whereas the leading American companies are proprietary, and so you can't just, maybe you can, if you're very, very, very good, you can jailbreak GPT and Claude, but it's not something that you can just open up and look under the hood the way that you can with certain Chinese models. But you're right that most people will probably not do that, which I think is one of the reasons why you're not going to be able to stop that. First of all, like the rest of like, let's say that the American government said no, Americans are no longer allowed to use Chinese models. I imagine that would raise some First Amendment issues, but let's just say it's parallel to the TikTok ban, and the Supreme Court said we're convinced that there's a sufficiently serious threat to national security, that this passes constitutional muster. But then the rest of the world, will maybe not have the same attitude and will be happy to use Chinese models, and they will then have an influence on what ideas and information the rest of the world gets access to, which is why I'm hoping that democracies develop open source models that can compete with these Chinese models on both on capability and price, obviously. I think that is probably the best liberal way forward. That is not to say that there aren't trade-offs, that there can't you can probably imagine catastrophic scenarios with the capabilities of these models. I don't think you can just, even though there's always this panic around new technologies, then you probably can't discount that these models could potentially be used for catastrophic harm. But then again, I read somewhere that 40%, an estimate, I think it was like 40% of all emails are spam and scam, right? So imagine, someone comes to you and tells governments, hey, we have this great new this great new way, facilitate communication immensely. You can immediately share information and with people all around the world, and they say, "Oh, that's great." Are there any downsides? Well, 30 to 40% of all messages sent will be spam and scam, and some of them will result in people being defrauded for billions and billions of dollars cumulatively. Some people will be, affected to the extent where they will commit suicide. They will lose everything that they have. That is the reality behind that. How much serious crime involve mobile cell phones today. A lot. From detonating bombs to coordinating hits. To recording, child pornography, and so on and so forth. So there is an inherent risk in technology. Technology will be able to be used for good and bad. I think generally the right principle is to not adopt what I call preemptive safetyism in the book, but instead rely on user empowerment. And that means that, in many cases, we already do have laws that will criminalize certain uses of technology, rather than sort of, if we said that because we're concerned about the spread of child abuse on mobile phones, all messages had to be scanned by your AT&Ts and T-Mobiles.
Right.
Most people would say, well, that's pretty creepy. That invades my privacy. It inhibits my First Amendment rights, because I'm not going to be willing to write the things that I normally do if I know that this is being scanned and could potentially be shared with the government. And so we accept that technology can be used for nefarious purposes, and then we generally try to have a more targeted approach where we criminalize and punish those uses. But that still allows or still tolerates to a certain extent that, yes, bad things will also happen, which I think is inevitable, right?
I think you've made this point in both your last books, that we've been, governments and would-be censors have been saying since the days of Gutenberg that this big new technology means we need big new ways of fighting misinformation and harms that can be perpetuated by the technology. And that's kind of the great temptation, is to say that,
Yeah.
these paradigm shifts, from the internet to social media to, I guess, AI now, that it demands new big formidable regimes with new tools and new laws to fight abuse of these systems. And that's one of the impulses that liberal societies really need to try and resist.
Yeah, and I mean, it's even before the printing press. Like, Socrates warns against the written word, and the consequences of that. So that's absolutely true. It's what in my previous book I call elite panic. That's a recurring phenomenon throughout the history of free speech. That whenever the public sphere is expanded through new communications technology, those who are sort of the institutional gatekeepers worry about the consequences of that, because of disruptions, because of challenges to authority, and so on. And sometimes, and very often they're right. Authority will be disrupted, but and if you're the Catholic Church, that's not great. During the Reformation, it's also not great for all the people who die in religious wars. But from our vantage point, the printing press is pretty astounding development that has made the lives a lot better, and probably saved hundredfold more or thousandfold more lives than it cost to die due to its disruption.
I think one of the instances of what you call elite panic that you pointed to in the future of free speech is uh, overestimating the ability of misinformation campaigns to turn elections. That it seems very big and scary, and I think we're right to be worried about it. But when we've studied it closely, when we've really looked at the numbers, the effect it's had has been fairly minimal.
Yeah. So we forget that if in the 1990s, early 2000s, all the way up to the Arab Spring, really, social media and the internet was seen as something very positive and pro-democracy. Then you have Brexit and you have the election of Donald Trump, and suddenly this narrative spreads that these events only happened because of Russian disinformation campaigns and so on. I think the empirical research pretty much debunks those claims. The reason Donald Trump won in 2016 was not because of Russian disinformation. Russian disinformation campaigns were real, but there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that they swung a critical mass of voters. And we also saw it in 2024 as a global super election year. With AI, there were all these alarmist stories about how a super election year with 2 billion eligible voters around the world would drown in deep fakes and so on. And the the autopsy of these elections actually shows that that there's very little to show that any elections were significantly affected. There were lots of deep fakes, lots of politicians and people used AI, but not in ways that seem to have swung or significantly impacted elections.
You talk as well. I don't know if this is part of the super election, but you talk as well of Taiwan, which was, in one of the last chapters of your book, you hold them up as an example. And in its last election, when its ruling party was looking for a third term in power, and Taiwan's elections were subject to a relentless CCP orchestrated misinformation campaign, which ultimately failed.
Yeah, Taiwan is quite interesting in the sense that, yeah, Taiwan lives with an existential threat from mainland China, obviously, much more vulnerable than, say, a Western European country vis-a-vis Russia. That there's no NATO, there's no guarantee that the U.S. will show up if China decides to invade. Um, but generally, Taiwan has chosen not to adopt sort of a top-down speech restrictive censorship regime when it comes to combating Chinese disinformation. Instead, they've adopted a policies based on radical transparency and also revolutionized crowdsourced fact checking. So that gives users an immediate access to try and test claims. And that's sort of one of the inspirations behind what we see, what we know as community notes, now that most prominently on X, but that has also migrated onto other social media platforms, and which has lots of research shows that community or crowdsourced fact checking can is easier to scale for obvious reasons, but also that it can be as accurate as professional fact checkers. And it people are more trusting of crowdsourced fact checking because crowdsourced fact checking typically builds on a bridging algorithm. So that means that people with very different viewpoints a critical mass of people with different viewpoints have to agree that a community node is useful based on the argumentation, the documentation, and so on. And so if you know that, let's say, 20,000 people have who might be independents, Republicans, and Democrats all agree and have voted, said, I find this community node useful because I think that the documentation debunking whatever claim it might be is persuasive. That tends to be harder to dismiss than if it's a professional fact checker or just, if you're a very conservative person, strong Republican, and the New York Times or MSNBC call something disinformation, then you might see it as a badge of honor, or you just say, well, that's just their partisanship coming through. And the same thing, if you're very liberal, progressive, and Fox News calls something disinformation, you're maybe likely to just dismiss it out of hand rather than engage with it. But that becomes more difficult if it's your peers, if you like, ordinary citizens.
Sure. Um, I'm going to shift topics slightly, although I'm staying in the general realm of digital rights and digital expression. But one one issue that uh, comes up a little bit, but not all that much, in the future of free speech is the issue of age gating the internet, of putting age requirements on social media, which the book does discuss. Australia is now experimenting with a law banning social media for children under 16. But there's been a movement in many places, but I'm thinking in the United States where some states have started putting age verification requirements on access to adult websites. And I think you know, one of maybe the biggest development in our First Amendment playbook since the future of free speech was sent to print, is that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Texas, which had these age verification requirements, so, before you're able to access adult websites.
Yeah.
And this is something that civil libertarians, my old colleagues at FIRE, organizations like the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation have been very critical of, because they see it as a tool for unwinding digital privacy and anonymity on the internet. I find very compelling the argument that it's quite a lot different to give my ID to a bouncer at a bar to make sure I'm able to buy a beer, than it is to upload that kind of information of mine up onto the internet where God knows who might be able to get their hands on it. So I wonder if when it comes to digital freedom, how big a role you see that trend playing, and whether you see real implications for privacy and anonymity as well.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely spot on. I think it's probably the biggest vector of attack right now on online freedom. Age verification laws that have mushroomed and gained real momentum around the world. It was actually when we were writing the book, Jeff said he wanted a chapter on that. I was a little bit skeptical, but it turned out that we should have written a chapter that was twice as long. Um, yeah, and so in the book we also detail how these kinds of laws have often been used as a Trojan horse for wider censorship. For instance, in Russia, where in 2012, Putin orchestrated his comeback as president through a fraudulent election, and there was a protests that were organized on social media platforms. And so that did not please Putin. So the Russian government adopted this law that essentially created a federal censorship commission that could create a blacklist of websites that were to be blocked. And that was done in the name of child protection, um, against child abuse, pornography, suicide, blah, 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 all these things, and has obviously, it essentially became the opening, the first move towards what some call the red web, sort of this elaborate system of online censorship that Russia has built out. And I think there's a not unreasonable risk that these efforts could lead to some of the same things, not to the same extent as Russia, but definitely, you already see sort of the slippery slope being not theoretical and alarmist, but real when you sort of say people show, well, these age verification laws don't necessarily work because people use VPNs. Then you see politicians coming, well, let's ban VPNs. And how long are you willing to go to try and enforce these bans? And I also, it it obviously undermines also anonymity, which I think is, if you look at the history of free speech, anonymity has been absolutely essential, right? Um, this is the 250th of America. Common Sense, which was instrumental in that, was written by Tom Paine, but he didn't sign Common Sense. Tom Paine. The Federalist Papers were used writing pseudonyms. And if you look at, great Enlightenment writings from Spinoza to John Locke to Voltaire, they were all anonymous or written using pseudonyms because there was a real danger if you used your own name because of censorship restrictions. So the fact that so many open liberal democracies who have benefited from that heritage of people who wrote anonymously now willing to sacrifice that principle is quite astounding, I think.
Yeah.
And then you see a lot of people congratulating countries like Indonesia, United Arab Emirates, and so for joining the movement of age verification. I mean, these are not exactly liberal countries. Does Jonathan Haidt really expect Indonesia and United Arab Emirates to keep their age verification laws strictly limited to children and not being used to target dissidents and so on? I think that's incredibly naive.
Yeah. I've had one more question coming from our attendees, and then so I'm gonna take that, and then I'm gonna give you a minute because I'd love for you to be able to talk about the upcoming Global Free Speech Summit and what you have planned for that. But question from an attendee, if we have a new national emergency, be it a pandemic or a war threat or a cyber attack in the U.S. or Europe, would you expect free speech restrictions in response? Or are we learning something from the cycles that you describe in your
No,
book?
I think we're most definitely would see. So it's actually amazing, for all the civil liberty implications of the Patriot Act and so on after 9/11. I think the First Amendment generally held up pretty well. You could imagine if you did not have a speech protective First Amendment, what could have happened? What types of restrictions you would have been put in place, given what had gone before, in U.S. history with the Red Scares and so on. But I think today there would be much more appetite because, not least of social media, just because there's this sense of loss of control by decision makers, politicians, and so on. And so, because if there was a new 9/11, God forbid, so much propaganda and information around it would be out there, and there would be this sense we can't control it. That I think there would be very strong and probably unstoppable pressures to use restrictions to clamp down on it.
Mhm. Well, Jakob, we're almost at time, but like I said, I'd love for you to put in a word for the Global Free Speech Summit this year. I was there last year. I had a terrific time. I'd be going back there again this year if it wasn't for the fact that I'm going to be out of the country when the conference is going on. But could you tell us a little bit about its mission, what kind of programming you're having this year, what some of the big issues you're going to be discussing are, what some of the things you're looking forward to most about this year's gathering are?
Well, first of all, what I look most forward to is welcoming this is our third annual summit, and it's a really great community that I think we're growing of people who have an interest and expertise around free speech, but from all over the world. It's not only the U.S. Last year we had um, a stand-up comedian from Sri Lanka who had been in
Hmm.
prison for poking fun of the Buddha. We had a Afghan teacher who runs underground schools for girls. So we have people from all over the world, and we'll have that again this year. Um, we'll have some keynote fireside chats with Johan Norberg, the Swedish author who's written a book that really shows how important free speech has been to all successful civilizations. We'll have Taylor Lorenz in a debate about age verification. I think that will be spicy. We will have discussions about the state of free speech in Europe with Asita Kango, who's an MEP from the European Parliament. We'll have another potentially spicy debate about free speech in America in this 250th between Eugene Volokh and Marianne Franks, two First Amendment scholars with very different perspectives on the First Amendment and its limits. So I think that will be interesting. And then there will be a lot of side events where you can sort of pick and choose, and there'll be lots of social gatherings. There'll be much more time this year to socialize, to network, and hopefully meet interesting people who might be able to help you with whatever free speech related topic you're working on. Grow a coalition, write a co-author a paper, build an app, whatever. Things like that is what I like to see come out of the summit, which takes place on October 2nd and 3rd in Nashville, Tennessee. So go to Global Free Speech Summit and online and sign up.
What a bummer that I'm going to be 13 or 14 time zones away. But we'll do our best to get some of our people there, and we will definitely help spread the word because I really enjoyed my time there last year. It's a really worthwhile event, and I met a lot of great people there. So we'll do what we can to help get the word out. But in the meantime, Jakob, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule today to speak with us. Everyone, I highly encourage you to pick up The Future of Free Speech. I really enjoyed the read. It's a really great look at kind of the state of free speech in the world today, even with it being the fast-moving target it is. So Jakob, thanks so much. I hope we'll have a chance to do this again sometime, and best of luck at the Global Free Speech Summit this fall.
Thank you, Peter. Absolute pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for joining. Take care.